The sound of rotor blades cutting through the crisp December air made everyone at the Whitmore family Christmas dinner freeze mid-conversation. Through the frosted windows of the suburban Connecticut home, they watched in stunned silence as a sleek black helicopter descended onto the snow-covered front lawn, its landing lights illuminating the carefully manicured garden that had been Margaret Whitmore's pride for 30 years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Inside the aircraft, Sarah Chen adjusted her aviator sunglasses and smiled. 5 years ago, she'd been sitting at this very dinner table, listening to her relatives tear apart every dream she'd ever shared. Tonight, she was about to make an entrance they'd never forget. The last normal Christmas dinner Sarah had attended was in 2019. She remembered every detail of that night, because it had become the fuel for everything that followed. The Whitmore family had gathered at her Aunt Margaret's sprawling colonial house in Westport, Connecticut, just as they had every Christmas Eve for the past 2 decades. The dining room table groaned under the weight of traditional holiday fare: honey-glazed ham, roasted turkey, candied yams, and Margaret's famous cranberry sauce that she guarded like a state secret. Sarah had been 26 then, fresh out of graduate school, with a degree in aerospace engineering and a head full of ambitious plans. She'd spent months preparing for this moment, rehearsing in her mind how she'd announce her intentions to start her own aviation company. The business plan was solid. She'd checked and rechecked every number, every projection, every contingency. She had connections from her internship at Sikorsky Aircraft, a small inheritance from her grandmother, and most importantly, an unshakable belief that she could revolutionize emergency medical transport. The conversation had started innocently enough. Her cousin David was bragging about his promotion at the investment firm, while her brother Michael detailed his latest real estate acquisitions. When the spotlight finally turned to Sarah, she took a deep breath and launched into her presentation. "I'm starting my own helicopter company," she announced, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Emergency medical services, specifically. The response times in rural areas are abysmal, and I've identified a gap in the market that we can fill with the right aircraft and properly trained crews." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the contemplative quiet of people processing exciting news. It was the awkward hush that descends when someone says something completely inappropriate at a funeral. Her uncle Robert was the first to break the silence, his laugh sharp and dismissive. "Sarah, honey, you can't just start a helicopter company. Do you have any idea what kind of capital that requires? What about insurance, regulatory compliance? You're talking about millions of dollars and years of red tape." Margaret nodded sagely from her position at the head of the table. "Robert's right, dear. It's a nice dream, but you need to be realistic. Maybe you should look into getting a job at an established company first. Build up some experience, you know." Sarah's father, Tom, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd always been supportive of her ambitions, but the weight of family opinion was clearly affecting him. "Sarah, your heart's in the right place, but maybe you should consider something more stable. Boeing is hiring engineers, good benefits, steady paycheck." But it was her cousin Jennifer who delivered the killing blow. Jennifer, who'd never worked a day in her life but had married well and considered herself an expert on business matters. She set down her wine glass with theatrical precision and fixed Sarah with a patronizing smile. "Sarah, sweetie, I think what everyone's trying to say is that you need to be more realistic about your limitations. Starting a company isn't like finishing a school project. It requires leadership, business acumen, connections, things that take years to develop. You've always been the dreamer in the family, but at some point, you need to grow up and join the real world." The words hit like physical blows. Sarah felt her cheeks burning, but she pressed on. "I have a business plan. I've done the research. The market analysis shows—" "Market analysis?" David interrupted with a snort. "Sarah, you've been in school your whole life. What do you know about running a business? About managing employees? About dealing with investors who'll eat you alive the moment you show weakness?" Her younger sister Emma chimed in, perhaps thinking she was being helpful. "Maybe you could start smaller? Like, get a job as a pilot first? Work your way up?" "I'm not a pilot," Sarah said quietly. I'm an engineer. I understand the technical aspects, the maintenance requirements, the operational efficiency. Exactly, Robert exclaimed, as if she'd just proved his point. You're not even qualified to fly the helicopters you want to buy. How are you going to run a company based on something you can't even do yourself? The criticism kept coming, each family member adding their own version of why Sarah's dream was impossible. She wasn't experienced enough. She didn't have the right connections. She was too young, too naive, too idealistic. The helicopter industry was dominated by established players who wouldn't hesitate to crush a newcomer. Her Aunt Carol, who'd been quiet throughout the dinner, finally spoke up. Sarah, I know you're upset, but we're saying this because we love you. We don't want to see you waste your life chasing something that's never going to happen. You're a smart girl. You could have a good career if you just focused on realistic goals. But what if it could work? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if I could make it happen? The question hung in the air for a moment before Robert answered with brutal finality. It won't work, Sarah. You'll never amount to anything in business. You don't have what it takes. The sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be. Margaret nodded approvingly. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is help someone see the truth about themselves. Sarah, dear, you're meant for other things. There's no shame in that. Sarah looked around the table at the faces of her family. People she'd loved and trusted her entire life. She saw pity in some eyes, dismissal in others, and something that looked almost like satisfaction in a few. They'd made their judgment and there was no appeal. She excused herself from the table, mumbling something about needing air. In the bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her had red-rimmed eyes and slumped shoulders. She looked defeated, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if they were right. But then she remembered why she'd wanted to start the company in the first place. During her internship, she witnessed a medical emergency in a rural area where the nearest hospital was over an hour away by ground transport. A young father had suffered a heart attack while hiking with his family, and by the time emergency services reached him, it was too late. The paramedics had done everything they could, but the distance was simply too great. Sarah had spent that night researching response times, survival rates, and the correlation between rapid medical intervention and positive outcomes. The data was clear. Every minute mattered, and in rural areas, those minutes were being lost to geography and inadequate infrastructure. She'd also discovered that the helicopter emergency medical services industry was dominated by a few large companies that focused primarily on urban areas and high-profit routes. Rural communities were underserved, not because the need wasn't there, but because the existing companies couldn't make the economics work with their current business models. Sarah believed she could change that. Her engineering background had shown her ways to reduce operational costs through better maintenance protocols, more efficient routing systems, and strategic partnerships with rural hospitals. She'd identified funding sources, potential clients, and even preliminary agreements with medical facilities that were desperate for better emergency response options. But sitting in her aunt's powder room, listening to the muffled sounds of her family continuing their dinner conversation without her, all of that seemed impossibly far away. She returned to the table, finished her meal in silence, and left that night with a polite smile and hollow thanks for a lovely dinner. On the drive home to her small apartment in Hartford, she replayed every criticism, every dismissive comment, every reason why her dream was impossible. For 3 weeks she wallowed. She applied for positions at established aerospace companies, went through the motions of interviews, and tried to convince herself that a steady paycheck and corporate benefits were what she really wanted. But every time she thought about settling for someone else's vision of her future, she felt something die inside her. The turning point came on a gray January morning when she was reading the local newspaper over coffee. A small article on page 6 caught her attention. Rural hospital struggles with emergency response times. The story detailed how Windham Hospital, serving a largely rural population in eastern Connecticut, had lost 3 patients in the past month due to delays in emergency transport. Sarah stared at the article for a long time, then pulled out her laptop and began typing. Not a job application this time, but a detailed proposal for Windham Hospital's board of directors. She worked for 14 hours straight, refining her business model, adjusting her projections, and crafting a presentation that would demonstrate exactly how her company could solve their problem. 2 weeks later, she was sitting across from Dr. Patricia Martinez, Wyndham Hospital's chief of emergency medicine, in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Martinez said, reviewing Sarah's proposal, "this is exactly what we need, but I have to ask, do you have any experience actually running a business? Because what you're proposing is ambitious, to say the least." Sarah took a deep breath. "I don't have business experience, Dr. Martinez, but I have something else. I have a personal commitment to making this work. I've seen what happens when people don't get the help they need in time. I've done the research, I understand the technology, and I'm willing to stake everything on making this succeed." Dr. Martinez studied her for a long moment. "I've been practicing emergency medicine for 25 years, Ms. Chen. I've seen a lot of young people with big dreams and good intentions. Most of them give up when they realize how hard it really is. What makes you different?" Sarah thought about that Christmas dinner, about her family's absolute certainty that she would fail. "Because I have to prove them wrong," she said simply. "Not just to them, but to myself. And because there are people out there who need this service, and if I don't make it happen, who will?" A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Dr. Martinez smiled for the first time during their meeting. "I like that answer. Let me talk to the board. If they approve, we'll give you a trial contract. 6 months to prove your concept. But Sarah, and I'm going to call you Sarah, because if we're going to work together, we need to drop the formalities. You need to understand that this is going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. You're going to fail more times than you succeed, at least at first. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah nodded. "I'm more prepared for failure than I am for giving up." 3 months later, Sarah was standing in a hangar she'd rented in Groton, Connecticut, staring at her first helicopter. It wasn't much to look at. A used Eurocopter EC-135 with high hours and a paint job that had seen better days. But it was airworthy, properly maintained, and most importantly, it was hers. Well, technically it belonged to Chen Emergency Medical Services, the company she'd incorporated after Dr. Martinez's board had approved her trial contract. The paperwork had been a nightmare: insurance requirements, FAA certifications, state licensing, equipment specifications. She'd spent countless hours on the phone with regulators, insurance agents, and equipment suppliers, learning a new language of acronyms and compliance requirements. The money had been even more challenging. Her grandmother's inheritance had covered the initial deposit, but she'd needed substantial additional funding to make the purchase. Traditional banks had laughed at her loan applications. A young woman with no business experience wanting to start a helicopter company was apparently the banking equivalent of a joke. But Sarah had persisted, eventually finding a group of angel investors who specialized in supporting women-owned businesses in traditionally male-dominated industries. The pitch meeting had been terrifying, but her passion and technical expertise had won them over. They'd provided the capital she needed, along with something even more valuable: mentorship from successful entrepreneurs who understood the challenges she was facing. The real challenge, though, had been finding qualified pilots and medical personnel. The helicopter emergency medical services industry was small and tight-knit, and word had gotten around that a newcomer was trying to break into the market. Some of the established companies had made it clear to their employees that anyone who joined Sarah's venture would be blacklisted. But she'd eventually found her team. Captain James Rodriguez was a former military pilot who'd been looking for a new challenge after retiring from the Army. Maria Santos was a paramedic with 15 years of experience, who'd grown frustrated with the limitations of ground-based emergency services. Dr. Michael Thompson was a young emergency medicine resident who believed in Sarah's vision and was willing to work part-time as their medical director. Together, they'd spent weeks training, drilling, and perfecting their procedures. They'd practiced medical scenarios, emergency landings, and night operations. Sarah had even started taking flying lessons herself, not because she planned to pilot the aircraft, but because she wanted to understand every aspect of the operation. The first call had come on a Tuesday morning in April. A construction worker had fallen from scaffolding at a job site in a rural area 30 miles from Wyndham Hospital. The local ambulance service estimated a 45-minute transport time by ground. Sarah's helicopter made it in 12 minutes. The patient survived, and Sarah had felt something she'd never experienced before: the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. All the doubt, all the criticism, all the sleepless nights worrying about cash flow and regulatory compliance had been worth it for that one moment when she knew she'd made a difference. But success, she quickly learned, brought its own challenges. The established companies weren't happy about losing market share to an upstart, and they began putting pressure on hospitals and insurance companies to exclude Sarah's service from their networks. Equipment failures became more frequent, and Sarah suspected sabotage but couldn't prove it. Several key employees received job offers from competitors at salaries she couldn't match. The breaking point came in September when her primary helicopter suffered a catastrophic engine failure during a routine maintenance flight. Nobody was hurt, but the aircraft was grounded for 3 weeks while replacement parts were shipped from Europe. The delay cost her 2 major contracts and pushed the company to the brink of bankruptcy. Sarah found herself working 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the hangar office, and surviving on coffee and determination. She'd lost 15 pounds and developed a persistent cough that she ignored. Her savings were gone, her credit cards were maxed out, and the angel investors were starting to ask pointed questions about her business plan. It was during this dark period that she received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Martinez. The hospital board had been reviewing the data from Sarah's first 6 months of operation, and the results were remarkable. Response times had improved by an average of 32 minutes, and patient outcomes had improved correspondingly. They wanted to extend her contract and increase the volume of calls. More importantly, word was spreading. Other rural hospitals were inquiring about Sarah's services, and she began to see a path forward that didn't involve constantly fighting for survival. She could build a network of small, strategically located bases that would serve underserved communities throughout New England. The vision was ambitious, but Sarah had learned that ambitious wasn't the same as impossible. She'd also learned that the criticism she'd received at that Christmas dinner had been wrong about one crucial thing. She did have what it took to succeed in business. She just had to define success on her own terms. By the winter of 2020, Sarah's operation had grown from a single helicopter to a fleet of 3 aircraft strategically positioned across Connecticut and western Massachusetts. The expansion hadn't been smooth. The COVID-19 pandemic had initially devastated the industry, as hospitals postponed elective procedures and emergency calls dropped dramatically. But Sarah had adapted quickly, pivoting to provide essential medical transport for COVID patients who needed specialized care at distant facilities. The pandemic had also presented an unexpected opportunity. Several established helicopter companies had struggled with the economic downturn, and Sarah was able to purchase quality aircraft at below-market prices. She'd acquired a nearly new Airbus H135 from a company that had gone bankrupt, and a well-maintained Bell 407 from another operator who was consolidating their fleet. Her team had expanded as well. Captain Rodriguez had been promoted to chief pilot and was overseeing a growing roster of aviators. Maria Santos had become the operations manager, coordinating with hospitals and emergency services across their expanding territory. Dr. Thompson had completed his residency and joined the company full-time as medical director, bringing with him 2 other emergency medicine physicians who believed in Sarah's vision. The financial picture was finally stabilizing. The angel investors had been pleased with the company's growth trajectory and had provided additional funding for expansion. Sarah had also secured a significant contract with Massachusetts General Hospital to provide interfacility transport for their satellite locations. The steady revenue stream allowed her to focus on long-term strategic planning rather than day-to-day survival. But success in business, Sarah had learned, came with its own set of challenges. The established players in the industry had initially dismissed her as a minor irritant, but as her market share grew, they began to take notice. Medflight Northeast, the dominant player in the region, had started underbidding her contracts and poaching her employees with lucrative offers. The situation came to a head in March 2021 when Sarah lost her biggest contract. Worcester Medical Center, which had been one of her anchor clients, announced they were switching to Medflight Northeast. The stated reason was cost savings, but Sarah suspected there was more to the story. She was right. A week later, one of her former employees called with disturbing news. MedFlight Northeast had been spreading rumors about Chen Emergency Medical Services, questioning their safety record and suggesting that Sarah's rapid expansion was reckless. They'd also been offering hospitals exclusive deals that made it financially impossible for smaller operators to compete. Sarah found herself facing a classic David versus Goliath scenario. MedFlight Northeast had deep pockets, political connections, and decades of established relationships. They could afford to operate at a loss in specific markets just to drive out competition. Sarah's operation, while profitable, didn't have the resources to engage in a protracted price war. The crisis forced Sarah to think creatively about her business model. Instead of trying to compete directly with MedFlight Northeast for high-volume urban contracts, she decided to focus on the underserved rural markets that the larger companies ignored. She'd build a network of small bases that could respond quickly to emergencies in areas where ground transport times were prohibitive. The strategy required significant changes to her operations. She partnered with regional hospitals to establish satellite bases, sharing costs and resources. She developed relationships with volunteer fire departments and emergency medical services in rural communities, providing training and equipment in exchange for priority access to emergency calls. Most importantly, she began investing heavily in technology. Sarah had always believed that better systems could overcome resource disadvantages, and she put her engineering background to work developing proprietary dispatch and routing software that could optimize helicopter deployment across multiple bases. The technology investment paid off dramatically. By the end of 2021, Chen Emergency Medical Services was handling more calls than ever before, with response times that consistently beat the industry average. The company had also achieved something that none of the larger operators had managed. They were profitable in rural markets that others considered economically unviable. The success attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The Federal Aviation Administration asked Sarah to participate in a study on helicopter emergency medical services in rural areas. She was invited to speak at industry conferences, where she shared her insights on technology integration and cost-effective operations. More significantly, she caught the attention of venture capital firms that specialized in healthcare technology. Aurora Ventures, a Boston-based firm, approached her about a potential partnership. They were impressed by her technology development and saw an opportunity to scale her model nationally. The due diligence process was intense. Sarah spent months providing detailed financial records, operational data, and strategic plans to Aurora's team of analysts. They scrutinized every aspect of her business, from maintenance protocols to pilot training programs. The process was exhausting, but Sarah had learned to view such challenges as opportunities to prove her competence. The partnership proposal was compelling. Aurora would provide $50 million in funding to expand Chen Emergency Medical Services across New England and into the Mid-Atlantic region. They'd also provide strategic guidance and connections to help Sarah navigate the complexities of rapid growth. But the deal came with conditions that made Sarah uncomfortable. Aurora wanted to replace her management team with experienced executives from larger healthcare companies. They also wanted to shift the company's focus from rural markets to more profitable urban routes. Essentially, they wanted to turn her innovative company into a conventional operator. Sarah spent sleepless nights considering the offer. The money would solve all her immediate problems and provide the resources for massive expansion. But accepting would mean abandoning the mission that had driven her from the beginning, serving underserved communities that the industry had forgotten. The decision became clear during a call in October 2022. A 7-year-old girl had been severely injured in a farming accident in a remote area of Vermont. The nearest trauma center was 2 hours away by ground transport, but Sarah's helicopter reached the scene in 25 minutes. The girl survived, and her parents' tearful gratitude reminded Sarah why she'd started the company in the first place. She turned down Aurora's offer and decided to pursue organic growth instead. The decision was financially challenging. She'd have to expand more slowly and accept higher risks, but it allowed her to maintain control over her company's mission and values. The rejection of venture capital funding proved to be a turning point. Without the pressure to maximize short-term returns, Sarah could focus on building sustainable operations that truly served their communities. She developed innovative partnerships with rural hospitals, created training programs for local emergency responders, and continued investing in technology that improved patient outcomes. By 2023, Chen Emergency Medical Services had become the premier helicopter emergency medical provider in rural New England. The company operated 12 aircraft from 8 bases and employed over 60 people. More importantly, they'd saved hundreds of lives in communities that had previously been underserved by emergency medical transport. Sarah's personal life had also stabilized. She'd moved from her cramped apartment to a comfortable home in Middletown, Connecticut, where she could unwind from the pressures of running a growing business. She'd started dating again, something she'd neglected during the intense early years of building the company. Dr. Amanda Foster was a trauma surgeon at Hartford Hospital, who'd worked closely with Sarah's crews on numerous cases. Their relationship had developed gradually, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to saving lives. Amanda understood the demands of Sarah's work because she faced similar pressures in her own career. The relationship had also provided Sarah with a new perspective on her achievements. Through Amanda's eyes, she began to see that her success wasn't just about proving her family wrong. It was about creating something genuinely valuable that improved people's lives. But even as her personal and professional life flourished, Sarah found herself thinking about that Christmas dinner in 2019. Her family had been so certain that she would fail, so dismissive of her dreams. They'd seen her ambition as naivety and her determination as foolishness. The memory still stung, even after all her success. She'd maintained minimal contact with most of her extended family since that night. Christmas cards were exchanged, but she declined invitations to family gatherings. The wounds from that dinner ran deep, and Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to face the people who'd been so eager to crush her dreams. The situation came to a head in November 2024, when her Aunt Margaret called with an unexpected invitation. Margaret was turning 70, and the family was planning a special celebration. She specifically asked Sarah to attend, mentioning that the whole family would be there and that it had been too long since they'd all been together. Sarah's first instinct was to decline politely, as she had for the past several years. But something in Margaret's voice suggested this wasn't just a routine invitation. There was a note of urgency, almost pleading, that made Sarah reconsider. She discussed the situation with Amanda, who encouraged her to attend. "You've accomplished everything you set out to do," Amanda said. "You've built an incredible company, saved countless lives, and proven that your vision was right. Maybe it's time to let them see what you've become." The decision to attend the celebration wasn't easy. Sarah had spent years building walls around the pain from that Christmas dinner, and the thought of facing her family again brought back all the old emotions. But she also realized that avoiding them forever wasn't healthy. She'd grown beyond the young woman who'd been so devastated by their criticism. As the date approached, Sarah found herself planning not just what to wear, but how to present herself. She wanted to be gracious and mature, to show that she'd moved beyond any bitterness. But she also wanted them to understand, in no uncertain terms, that their judgment had been wrong. The perfect opportunity presented itself when she received an invitation to speak at a medical conference in New Haven, scheduled for the same weekend as Margaret's celebration. The conference was focused on emergency medical services innovation, and Sarah's presentation on rural helicopter operations was the keynote address. An idea began to form, one that would allow her to attend the family celebration while also making a statement about how far she'd come. It would require careful timing and some theatrical flair, but Sarah had learned that sometimes the most effective communication required drama. She began making arrangements for what would become one of the most memorable family gatherings in Whitmore history. This time, she wouldn't arrive as the defeated young woman who'd been dismissed and humiliated. This time, she'd arrive on her own terms, in her own style, with the sound of rotor blades announcing her success to anyone within miles. The plan was audacious, perhaps even a little petty, but after 5 years of proving herself in the most demanding industry imaginable, Sarah felt she'd earned the right to a moment of vindication. Her family had been so certain she'd never amount to anything. Soon, they'd discovered just how wrong they'd been. As December approached, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The girl who'd been broken by their criticism was gone, replaced by a confident businesswoman who'd built something extraordinary from nothing. The upcoming celebration would be more than just a birthday party. It would be a reckoning, a final answer to the question of whether Sarah Chen had what it took to succeed. The helicopter was fueled and ready. The crew was briefed on the unusual mission. All that remained was to execute the plan that would give her family and herself the closure they all needed. December 22, 2024, dawned crisp and clear in New Haven, Connecticut. Sarah stood at the podium of the Yale Medical School auditorium, looking out at an audience of 500 emergency medicine professionals, hospital administrators, and healthcare policymakers. The keynote presentation she'd just delivered on revolutionary approaches to rural emergency medical transport had been met with a standing ovation. Dr. Patricia Martinez, now serving as the president of the New England Emergency Medicine Association, approached the microphone for closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've heard today from Sarah Chen represents nothing less than a paradigm shift in how we approach emergency medical services. Her company has achieved what many thought impossible: profitable, sustainable helicopter operations in rural markets while maintaining response times that consistently exceed industry standards. Sarah smiled as she packed up her presentation materials. The conference had been a resounding success, with several hospital systems expressing interest in partnering with Chen Emergency Medical Services. But her mind was already shifting to the evening's real challenge, facing her family for the first time since that devastating Christmas dinner 5 years ago. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Margaret's 70th birthday celebration was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m., just as Sarah's conference obligations were concluding. She'd spent weeks coordinating with her flight crew to ensure everything would go smoothly. Captain Rodriguez had initially questioned the wisdom of landing a helicopter on a suburban lawn, but Sarah had assured him that the Whitmore property was large enough to accommodate their aircraft safely. The plan was audacious but simple. Sarah would arrive at the celebration exactly as her family expected. By car, through the front door, probably with an apologetic explanation for being late. She'd endure the initial awkwardness, the polite inquiries about her little helicopter business, and the subtle condescension that had characterized their previous interactions. Then, at precisely 8 p.m., Captain Rodriguez would lift off from the conference center helipad with Sarah aboard, making the 20-minute flight to Westport. The helicopter would land on the Whitmore family's front lawn, visible through the dining room's large windows, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Sarah changed from her conference attire into a tailored black dress that struck the perfect balance between professional and celebratory. She'd learned the importance of presentation during her years in business. How you looked often determined how seriously people took you before you even spoke. The drive to Westport took 45 minutes through holiday traffic. Sarah used the time to mentally prepare for what was about to unfold. She'd rehearsed various scenarios, from hostile confrontation to awkward small talk, but she suspected the reality would be more complex than anything she'd imagined. Margaret's house looked exactly as Sarah remembered it, a stately colonial with white columns and perfectly manicured landscaping. Holiday decorations adorned every window, and warm light spilled from the interior, creating an inviting scene that belied the tension Sarah felt building in her chest. She took a deep breath and walked up the familiar stone pathway. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing her cousin Jennifer, who'd aged noticeably in the 5 years since their last encounter. Jennifer's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like discomfort. "Sarah, you actually came. We weren't sure." Jennifer's voice trailed off as she struggled to find the right words. Come in. Everyone's in the living room." The house was filled with the sounds of family conversation, clinking glasses, and holiday music. Sarah recognized most of the voices, though she noticed some new ones as well. Grandchildren who'd grown up, spouses who'd joined the family, friends who'd become fixtures at these gatherings. Her entrance into the living room caused a momentary lull in conversation. Margaret, regal in a burgundy dress with her silver hair perfectly styled, rose from her chair with a genuine smile. "Sarah, dear, I'm so glad you could make it. You look wonderful." The embrace was warm but brief. and Sarah could feel the eyes of her extended family assessing her. She'd expected this moment to be more dramatic, but the reality was almost anticlimactic. These people who'd loomed so large in her memory seemed smaller now, more ordinary. Her Uncle Robert approached with a drink in hand, his demeanor cautiously friendly. "Sarah, good to see you. Margaret tells me you're still involved with helicopters. How's that working out?" The question was casual, but Sarah caught the underlying assumption that her helicopter venture was probably a hobby or side project rather than a serious business. She smiled politely. "It's going well, Uncle Robert. We're keeping busy." The conversation continued in this vein for the next hour. Family members made polite inquiries about her work, her personal life, her plans for the future. But Sarah could sense the underlying skepticism. They were being kind, but they clearly didn't understand the magnitude of what she'd built. Her brother Michael, now sporting a receding hairline and extra weight around his middle, cornered her near the appetizer table. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said that Christmas a few years back, about starting a helicopter company. I hope you didn't take what everyone said too seriously. You know how family can be." Sarah studied his face, looking for genuine remorse or understanding. Instead, she saw the patronizing expression of someone who assumed she'd moved on to more realistic pursuits. "I didn't take it seriously at all, Michael. In fact, I used it as motivation." "Well, that's good. Motivation is important, whatever you end up doing." He paused, then added with the casual cruelty that had characterized their childhood interactions. "I mean, we all have dreams when we're young. The important thing is learning to adapt when reality sets in." Before Sarah could respond, her father appeared at her elbow. Tom Chen had aged considerably since their last meeting, his hair now completely gray and his face lined with worry. "Sarah, can I talk to you privately for a moment?" They stepped into Margaret's study, a quiet room lined with books and family photographs. Tom closed the door and turned to face his daughter, his expression serious. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. That Christmas dinner 5 years ago, I should have supported you. I should have stood up for your dreams instead of letting everyone tear them down." His voice was heavy with regret. "I've regretted it every day since." Sarah felt a wave of unexpected emotion. Of all the family members, her father's betrayal had hurt the most because she'd counted on his support. "Dad, Let me finish," he interrupted. "I know you've been successful. I've been following your company online, reading the articles about your work. I'm proud of you, Sarah. I should have said that years ago." The admission was more than Sarah had expected, and she felt her carefully constructed emotional defenses beginning to crack. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot. I tried to tell the others, about what you'd accomplished, but he shrugged helplessly, they think it's all exaggerated. Internet nonsense. They don't understand how big your company has become." Sarah checked her watch. It was 7:45 p.m. In 15 minutes, Captain Rodriguez would be lifting off from New Haven. "They're about to understand, Dad. They're about to understand completely." Tom looked confused, but before he could ask for clarification, Margaret's voice called them back to the living room. "Everyone, dinner is served." The dining room table was set with the same china and crystal that Sarah remembered from childhood family gatherings. The familiar ritual of passing dishes and filling glasses provided a comfortable backdrop for conversation, though Sarah found herself increasingly distracted by the approaching sound of rotor blades. The conversation had turned to David's latest investment successes, when Sarah heard the first faint thrum of an approaching helicopter. She glanced toward the windows, but the aircraft was still too far away to be visible, only she knew what was coming. "Sarah, you've been quiet," Carol observed. "How are things really going? Are you still playing around with that helicopter idea?" The condescension in the word playing was unmistakable. Sarah smiled serenely. "Actually, Aunt Carol, I'm not playing around at all. I'm running a multi-million-dollar company that operates 12 helicopters across 8 bases in 3 states. The statement was met with polite but skeptical silence. Jennifer laughed nervously. "Well, that sounds impressive, though I suppose it's easy to make claims." The sound of rotor blades was growing louder now, clearly audible over the dinner conversation. Several family members glanced toward the windows, but the helicopter was still approaching from the south, not yet visible from the dining room. "Claims?" Sarah repeated, her voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before. What kind of claims, Jennifer? Well, you know, Jennifer said, gesturing vaguely, people tend to exaggerate their accomplishments on social media. A small consulting business becomes a company. A part-time job becomes a career. We understand how it works. The helicopter was close now, its engine noise unmistakable. Robert frowned and looked toward the windows. Is that a helicopter? Seems awfully close. Sarah stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound drew everyone's attention, and she found herself the center of focus for the first time since arriving. You want to know about claims, Jennifer? About exaggeration? About reality setting in? The helicopter was directly overhead now, its rotors creating a rhythmic thumping that made conversation difficult. Margaret looked alarmed. What on earth is that pilot doing? They're going to wake the entire neighborhood. Sarah walked to the large windows that faced the front lawn. The helicopter was beginning its descent, its landing lights illuminating the snow-covered grass. She could see Captain Rodriguez in the pilot's seat, executing a perfect approach to the predetermined landing zone. Sarah, her father said, his voice filled with sudden understanding, please tell me you didn't. I did. Sarah's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. That's my helicopter, flown by one of my pilots, coming to pick me up after a very successful evening. The family rushed to the windows as the aircraft touched down on the lawn, its rotor wash, sending snow swirling in dramatic clouds. The sleek black machine looked impossibly large and impressive sitting on the manicured grass, its corporate logo clearly visible even in the evening light. Chen Emergency Medical Services, saving lives, serving communities. The silence in the dining room was deafening. Sarah could see her family's faces reflected in the window glass, expressions of shock, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. They were beginning to understand that everything they'd assumed about her life had been wrong. My God, Margaret whispered. Sarah, is that really yours? One of 12, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. We also have bases in Hartford, Springfield, Worcester, Burlington, Albany, Rutland, and Bangor. We employ 63 people and maintain contracts with 47 hospitals and medical centers. She turned to face her family, her silhouette backlit by the helicopter's lights. Last year, we responded to 2,847 emergency calls and transported 2,203 patients. Our average response time is 14 minutes faster than the industry standard. We've been profitable for 3 consecutive years, and our revenue last year exceeded $18 million. The numbers hit like physical blows. Sarah could see her family struggling to process the information, to reconcile the successful businesswoman standing before them with the defeated young woman who'd left their Christmas dinner 5 years ago. But how? David stammered. How did you? We thought. You thought I'd fail, Sarah said simply. You were absolutely certain I'd never amount to anything. You told me I didn't have what it takes, that I was too naive, too inexperienced, too unrealistic. She paused, letting the words sink in. You were wrong. Captain Rodriguez was shutting down the helicopter's engines, following the post-flight checklist they'd rehearsed. In a few minutes, he'd be ready for the return flight to their base in Middletown. Sarah, Robert said, his voice hoarse, we never meant we were just trying to be realistic. Realistic? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Uncle Robert, do you know what's realistic? Saving a 7-year-old girl who would have died without helicopter transport. Reducing emergency response times in rural communities by an average of 32 minutes. Building a company that employs dozens of people and serves thousands of patients. She moved away from the window, walking slowly around the dining table where her family sat in stunned silence. What's realistic is that I took your certainty that I'd fail and used it as fuel to succeed beyond anything you could have imagined. Margaret found her voice first. Sarah, dear, we're proud of you. We always believed. No, Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. You didn't believe. You crushed my dreams because you were afraid of your own limitations. You couldn't imagine success, so you assumed it was impossible. She stopped behind Jennifer's chair. You said I needed to join the real world, Jennifer. Well, I did. I joined the real world of business, where results matter more than opinions, where vision counts more than comfort, where the only limitations are the ones you accept. The helicopter's rotors were winding down now, the engine noise fading to a whisper. Through the windows, Sarah could see neighbors gathering on their porches and in their yards, drawn by the unusual spectacle of a helicopter landing in suburban Westport. "I have to go," Sarah announced. "I have an early morning meeting with the board of directors at Massachusetts General Hospital. They're expanding our contract to include all their satellite facilities." She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face her family one last time. "Oh, and just so there's no confusion about reality, that helicopter outside? It's worth $4 million. I own it outright. No loans, no leases, no partners. Just me and the company I built from nothing." The family watched in silence as Sarah walked out of the house and across the lawn toward her waiting aircraft. Captain Rodriguez had completed his post-flight inspection and was ready for departure. He helped her into the passenger seat and handed her a headset. "How did it go, boss?" he asked as he began the engine start sequence. Sarah looked back at the house, where her family was still gathered at the windows, watching in amazement as the helicopter prepared for takeoff. "Better than I ever imagined, James. Much better than I ever imagined." As the aircraft lifted off from the Whitmore family lawn, Sarah felt a weight she'd carried for 5 years finally lifting from her shoulders. She'd proven everything she'd set out to prove, answered every question about her capabilities, and demonstrated beyond any doubt that their judgment had been catastrophically wrong. The helicopter banked toward the east, its navigation lights blinking against the star-filled sky. Below them, the lights of Connecticut spread out like a constellation, each one representing lives that might someday depend on the service Sarah had built. She'd never amount to anything, they'd said. The sound of rotor blades cutting through the winter air suggested otherwise. The flight back to Middletown took 18 minutes through clear December skies. Sarah sat in comfortable silence, watching the familiar landscape pass below as Captain Rodriguez navigated toward their home base. The lights of Hartford sparkled in the distance, and she could see the distinctive outline of the Connecticut River winding through the valley. As they approached the Chen Emergency Medical Services headquarters, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The hangar complex had grown significantly since those early days when she'd worked out of a single rented space with one used helicopter. Now the facility housed 12 aircraft, a state-of-the-art maintenance shop, a training center, and administrative offices that employed dozens of people. "Base, this is Rescue 7 returning from transport," Rodriguez radioed to their dispatch center. "ETA 2 minutes. "Copy, Rescue 7. "Welcome home," came the familiar voice of their night dispatcher, Kelly Morrison. Kelly had been with the company for 3 years, one of many employees who'd joined because they believed in Sarah's mission of serving underserved communities. After they landed and Rodriguez began the post-flight procedures, Sarah walked through the hangar, checking on the evening operations. 2 helicopters were out on calls, one transporting a cardiac patient from a rural hospital to a specialty center in Boston, another responding to a multi-vehicle accident on a remote stretch of Interstate 91. The activity reminded her why she'd started this company in the first place. Somewhere out there, families were experiencing the worst moments of their lives, desperately hoping that help would arrive in time. Her crews were that help, and the helicopters were the lifeline that connected critical patients to life-saving care. Dr. Amanda Foster was waiting in Sarah's office when she returned from her hangar walkthrough. Amanda had been following the evening's events via text message, and her expression was a mixture of concern and curiosity. "So," Amanda said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk, "how did the great helicopter entrance go? Did you achieve the dramatic vindication you were hoping for?" Sarah kicked off her heels and poured herself a cup of coffee from the machine she kept in her office. It went exactly as planned, maybe better than planned. The look on their faces when that helicopter landed. She smiled at the memory. "I don't think I've ever seen people so completely speechless." "And how do you feel about it now?" Amanda asked. "Are you satisfied? Do you feel like you got the closure you needed?" The question made Sarah pause. She'd expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, perhaps even a little smug. Instead, she felt something more complex. A mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Accomplishment tinged with regret. I think I feel empty, Sarah said finally. For 5 years I've carried this anger, this need to prove them wrong. And now I have. But proving them wrong doesn't change what they said or how it made me feel at the time. Amanda nodded understandingly. Revenge isn't usually as satisfying as we imagine it will be. The people who hurt us don't suddenly become different people just because we've proven our point. My father apologized, Sarah said. Before the helicopter arrived, he pulled me aside and told me he was proud of what I'd accomplished. I think he genuinely regretted what happened that night. That must have meant something to you. It did, but it also made me realize how much time I've wasted being angry. 5 years of carrying that pain, when I could have been focused entirely on building something positive. Sarah sat down at her desk and looked out the window at her helicopter fleet. I used their criticism as motivation, and that worked. But I wonder what I could have accomplished if I'd been driven by pure passion, instead of the need to prove them wrong. The conversation was interrupted by the emergency radio crackling to life. Dispatch to all units, we have a Priority 1 call in Litchfield County. 53-year-old male, crushing chest pain, blood pressure dropping, ground EMS requesting immediate helicopter transport to Hartford Hospital. Sarah and Amanda listened as Kelly coordinated the response, dispatching Rescue 4 from their Torrington base. Within minutes, the helicopter was airborne, racing against time to reach a patient whose life hung in the balance. These were the moments that defined Sarah's company, when everything they'd built came together to save a single life. That's why you do this, Amanda said quietly. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to make sure that man gets to the hospital in time. Sarah watched the helicopter's navigation lights disappear into the night sky. You're right. But it took me 5 years to understand the difference. 3 days later, Sarah was surprised to receive a phone call from her Aunt Margaret. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with the careful politeness of people navigating unfamiliar emotional territory. Sarah, dear, I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, Margaret began. I owe you an apology. We all do. We were wrong to dismiss your dreams the way we did. I appreciate that, Aunt Margaret, Sarah replied, unsure where the conversation was heading. I've been doing some research since you left, Margaret continued. I looked up your company online, read some articles about your work. We had no idea how successful you'd become, or how important the work you're doing is. The admission stung more than Sarah expected. You could have found that information years ago. You chose not to because you'd already decided I was going to fail. You're right, Margaret admitted. We were so convinced that we knew better, that we understood the world in ways you didn't. We were arrogant and cruel, and I'm ashamed of how we treated you. Over the following days, Margaret's call was followed by others. David sent a handwritten letter acknowledging that his comments about her lack of business experience had been unfair and short-sighted. He'd looked up Chen Emergency Medical Services and was astounded by the scope of what she'd built. Jennifer called to apologize for her dismissive attitude, admitting that she'd been threatened by Sarah's ambition because it highlighted her own lack of direction. Even Robert, who'd been the most brutally critical that night, left a voicemail that surprised Sarah with its genuine remorse. Sarah, I was wrong about everything, his gravelly voice said. I let my own failures make me cynical about other people's dreams. What you've accomplished is remarkable, and I'm sorry I tried to crush it before it even began. The apologies were gratifying, but they also highlighted how much damage had been done by that single Christmas dinner. Sarah had spent 5 years building walls around herself, protecting her dreams from the people who were supposed to support them. Taking down those walls would require time and trust that she wasn't sure she was ready to give. Meanwhile, her business continued to evolve in unexpected directions. The helicopter entrance at Margaret's birthday party had generated significant media attention. A local news station had picked up the story, and it had quickly gone viral on social media. Connecticut CEO's epic helicopter entrance at family dinner became a feel-good story that resonated with anyone who'd ever been told their dreams were impossible. The viral attention brought opportunities Sarah hadn't anticipated. Harvard Business School invited her to be a guest lecturer on entrepreneurship and innovation. The New England Journal of Medicine requested an article on her company's impact on rural emergency medical outcomes. A major television network approached her about a documentary series on innovative healthcare delivery. More importantly, the visibility attracted the attention of rural hospitals and emergency services that desperately needed her help. Inquiries poured in from facilities in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and upstate New York. Each call represented communities where people were dying unnecessarily because help couldn't reach them in time. Sarah found herself facing a new kind of challenge, managing rapid expansion while maintaining the quality and mission focus that had made her company successful. She hired a team of operations specialists to evaluate potential new markets, ensuring that any expansion would be sustainable and beneficial to the communities they served. The growth phase required significant capital investment. Sarah's angel investors were eager to provide additional funding, but they came with expectations that made her uncomfortable. They wanted to see faster growth, higher profit margins, and eventual preparation for a public stock offering. The pressure to prioritize financial returns over mission objectives reminded Sarah why she'd rejected venture capital funding earlier. Instead, she explored alternative financing options. A consortium of rural hospitals agreed to provide upfront payments for guaranteed service availability. Several state governments offered grants for companies providing essential services to underserved areas. Most significantly, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services expressed interest in a pilot program that would use Sarah's model to address healthcare access issues nationwide. The federal opportunity was intriguing but complex. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who headed the Office of Rural Health Policy, visited Sarah's headquarters in early 2025 to discuss potential collaboration. The meeting took place in the conference room overlooking the main hangar, where Dr. Warren could see the constant activity of helicopters departing and returning from emergency calls. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Warren said, reviewing the operational data Sarah had prepared, "your work here represents exactly the kind of innovation we need to address the rural healthcare crisis. Response times that are 30% faster than the national average, patient survival rates that exceed urban benchmarks, and profitable operations in markets that others have abandoned." Sarah listened carefully as Dr. Warren outlined the federal government's vision for a national rural emergency medical transport network. The proposal would provide substantial funding for expansion, but it would also require Sarah to work within federal bureaucracy and regulatory frameworks that could slow innovation and complicate decision-making. "I'm interested," Sarah said, "but I need to understand how this would affect our operational autonomy. The reason we've been successful is because we can adapt quickly to local needs and make decisions based on medical necessity, rather than bureaucratic procedure." The conversation continued for 3 hours, covering everything from funding mechanisms to regulatory compliance requirements. Dr. Warren was impressed by Sarah's detailed understanding of both the technical and policy aspects of emergency medical transport. More importantly, she seemed to grasp that Sarah's success came from her commitment to mission over profit. "What would it take for you to consider this partnership?" Dr. Warren asked as the meeting concluded. Sarah looked out at her helicopter fleet, thinking about the communities they served and the lives they'd saved. "It would have to preserve our ability to innovate and respond to local needs. And it would have to expand access to underserved communities without compromising the quality of care we provide." "I think we can work within those parameters," Dr. Warren replied. "Let me take this back to Washington and see what kind of framework we can develop." 6 weeks later, Sarah stood on the stage at the International Association for Healthcare Transport Annual Conference in Las Vegas, delivering the keynote address to an audience of 2,000 industry professionals. Her presentation, Building Sustainable Emergency Medical Transport in Underserved Markets, detailed the innovations that had made her company successful and outlined a vision for nationwide expansion. The response was overwhelming. Healthcare administrators, emergency medical personnel, and government officials lined up after her speech to discuss potential partnerships and collaborations. Sarah realized that her company had become more than a regional success story. It was now recognized as a model for transforming emergency medical transport across the country. During the networking reception that followed, she was approached by Captain Maria Santos, who'd been her first paramedic and had later become operations manager. Maria had flown to Las Vegas specifically to attend Sarah's keynote, even though she was supposed to be on vacation. Boss, Maria said with a grin, I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of what we've built together. When I first joined your company, I thought I was just taking a job. I didn't realize I was joining a revolution. The comment touched Sarah more deeply than any industry recognition. Maria had been with her from the beginning, when they were operating out of a single hangar with used equipment and uncertain prospects. She'd believed in Sarah's vision when it was still just an idea, and she'd helped build it into something that was changing lives every day. Maria, you know that none of this would have been possible without people like you who believed in the mission, Sarah replied. The technology and the helicopters are just tools. The real difference comes from people who care about saving lives. As the conference concluded, Sarah flew back to Connecticut with a sense of anticipation rather than accomplishment. The federal partnership opportunity was still being negotiated, but preliminary discussions suggested it could provide the resources to expand her network to serve rural communities across 20 states. The expansion would require careful planning and substantial investment, but it would also allow her to fulfill the vision that had started with a single helicopter and a determination to prove her family wrong. But as she looked out the airplane window at the lights of small towns scattered across the landscape below, Sarah realized that proving her family wrong was no longer what motivated her. The real satisfaction came from knowing that each of those lights represented communities where her helicopters might someday provide the critical link between emergency and survival. 2 months later, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She called Margaret and accepted the dinner invitation that had been extended after that dramatic helicopter entrance. But she had conditions. The gathering would be small, the conversation would focus on the present rather than the past, and there would be no lectures about business or life choices. The dinner was held at her parents' house in Hartford, a neutral location that felt less emotionally charged than Margaret's Colonial. Sarah arrived by car this time, wearing jeans and a sweater that made her look more like the daughter and niece they remembered, rather than the successful CEO she'd become. The evening was tentative at first, with everyone carefully avoiding topics that might trigger old conflicts. But gradually, genuine conversations began to emerge. Sarah talked about her work, not as a defense of her choices, but as someone sharing what they were passionate about. Her family listened with what seemed like genuine interest, asking questions that showed they were trying to understand rather than judge. Her father had prepared a photo album of newspaper clippings and magazine articles about her company. He'd been quietly following her success for years, collecting evidence of her achievements that he'd been too proud or embarrassed to share. The gesture was more meaningful than any apology could have been. I kept these because I wanted to remember, Tom explained, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to remember what it looked like when someone followed their dreams, despite what everyone else thought was possible. And I wanted to remember how wrong I was to doubt you. The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd had as a family. Instead of the competitive dynamics and subtle put-downs that had characterized their previous interactions, there was genuine curiosity and respect. They talked about Sarah's challenges as an entrepreneur, her relationship with Amanda, her plans for expanding the company's reach. Jennifer, who'd been the most cutting in her criticism 5 years earlier, seemed genuinely interested in understanding how Sarah had overcome the obstacles they'd all insisted were insurmountable. I have to ask, she said hesitantly, how did you keep going when everyone was telling you it was impossible? I think I would have given up. Sarah considered the question carefully. I think I was lucky that you all hurt me so badly that night. It made me angry enough to prove you wrong, but it also made me understand that I couldn't depend on other people's approval to validate my dreams. I had to find the strength to believe in myself even when no one else would. The admission created a moment of uncomfortable silence. The family was beginning to understand that their criticism hadn't just been wrong, it had been actively harmful to someone they claimed to love. Robert, who'd been quiet throughout most of the dinner, finally spoke up. Sarah, I need you to know that what we did that night wasn't about you. It was about our own fears and limitations. We couldn't imagine succeeding the way you have, so we assumed it was impossible for anyone. The evening ended with hugs that felt genuine rather than obligatory. As Sarah drove home to her farmhouse in Durham, she felt a weight she'd carried for 5 years finally lifting from her shoulders. The anger that had fueled her success was gone, replaced by something more sustainable, a sense of purpose that came from knowing her work made a difference in the world. 3 months later, the federal partnership was finalized. The Department of Health and Human Services announced a $200 million initiative to expand rural emergency medical transport services, with Chen Emergency Medical Services as the primary contractor and model for implementation. The program would establish helicopter bases in underserved areas across the country, creating a network that could reach 95% of rural America within 30 minutes. Sarah stood in her office, looking out at the hangar where her first helicopter had once sat alone, and marveled at how far she'd come. The company she'd started with a single aircraft and a desperate need to prove herself had become a model for transforming emergency medical care nationwide. The network would employ thousands of people and save tens of thousands of lives. But perhaps more importantly, she'd learned that true success wasn't measured by proving others wrong. It was measured by the impact you made on the world. The girl who'd been told she'd never amount to anything had built something extraordinary, not because she'd needed to prove her worth, but because she'd refused to accept that geography should determine whether someone lived or died. The helicopter had landed, literally and figuratively, but the mission was just beginning. Across the country, rural communities that had been forgotten by the healthcare system would soon hear the sound of rotor blades cutting through the air, bringing hope and help when they needed it most. And somewhere in Connecticut, a young woman who'd once been crushed by her family's disbelief was now working to ensure that no one would ever have to die because help couldn't reach them in time. The transformation was complete. Sarah Chen had become exactly what she'd always dreamed of being. Not someone who proved her critics wrong, but someone who made the impossible possible for people who needed it most. 6 months after the federal contract announcement, Sarah received an unexpected invitation that brought her journey full circle. The Society of Women Engineers was hosting their annual gala in New York City, and they wanted to honor her with their Achievement Award for Innovation in Aerospace Engineering and Entrepreneurship. The award recognized women who had broken barriers and created lasting change in traditionally male-dominated fields. Standing at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, surrounded by hundreds of women who had overcome their own obstacles to succeed in engineering and technology, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. The audience included young women just starting their careers, seasoned professionals who had fought for recognition in corporate boardrooms, and entrepreneurs who had risked everything to build something meaningful. 5 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. I sat at a family dinner and shared my dream of starting a helicopter company. I was told with absolute certainty that I would never amount to anything. Tonight, I stand before you not because I proved them wrong, but because I discovered that their opinion never mattered. What mattered was the belief I found in myself and the mission that drove me forward. As she spoke, Sarah could see Amanda in the audience, beaming with pride. Next to her sat Tom Chen, who had flown to New York specifically to watch his daughter receive this recognition. The sight of her father in the audience, supporting her achievement after years of regret about his initial doubt, reminded Sarah that redemption was possible for everyone willing to embrace it. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.